When we think of the Wild West, we picture outlaws, saloons, and dusty shootouts. We rarely hear the stories that lived between the cracks of history. One of these stories belongs to Harry Allen, a trans man who rode through the Pacific Northwest in the early 1900s, defying every rule society tried to pass on him. While newspapers labeled him a she-man, Harry lived his truth with a cigarette in his mouth and boots on his feet, refusing to apologize for who he was. His life wasn't just rebellion. It was survival carved into a world that refused to understand him. This is more than a story about one man. It's a doorway into the hidden queer history of the American West, a past that's always been there, just buried beneath the legend. A land without labels. The West was, above all, a place of men. Rail camps, mining towns, cattle drives, these were overwhelmingly male domains. In 1880, one census in parts of Nevada showed men outnumbering women 9-1. In such gender-imbalanced frontiers, bachelorhood wasn't just common, it was a lifestyle. Cowboys slept under the same stars, but sometimes they also shared the same blankets. Men built cabins together, ranched together, and grew old together. Not always brothers, not always blood. In these wide spaces without women, new intimacies flourished. Even figures like Harry Allen, a trans man who lived openly in the early 1900s, found space to exist on their own terms. The West wasn't just a place to remake a man, it was a place to remake manhood itself. Early observers saw it. Missionary Myron Eales noted in 1877 that among indigenous peoples in Washington, there are men who assume the dress and work of women, and they are not treated with contempt. George Catlin described the Berdache in Plains tribes, men who lived as women and took male partners. But these accounts were filtered through colonial eyes. What they couldn't name, they misunderstood or erased. This was a land before labels. Queer and transgender are words of our time, not theirs. The people we now claim as LGBTQ+ lived without those names, but not without community. Historian Peter Boag reminds us, homosocial frontier life was not necessarily heterosexual. Men's emotional and sexual connections with other men weren't necessarily hidden. They simply weren't spoken about. Silence was not shame. It was survival. It's tempting to frame queer love on the frontier as rebellion. But what if it wasn't? What if it was just part of the fabric, like barbed wire or saddle leather? The cowboy myth hides as much as it reveals. It paints solitude, but ignores partnership. It glorifies violence, but forgets tenderness. And so we begin here, not with proof, but with possibility. A West where gender bent with the wind and desire slipped between definitions. Where a man could reinvent himself not only by crossing land, but by crossing the expectations of who he was supposed to love or be. Harry Allen, the man who refused to be a woman. In the fading newspapers of early 1900s Seattle, one name appears again and again, always wrapped in scandal, always misnamed, Harry Allen, or as they called him, the Girl Man of the West. Harry Allen was born in 1882 in Washington State to a world that would never see him as he saw himself. Assigned female at birth and named Nell Pickerel, Harry rejected that identity from the start. By his teens, he dressed in men's clothing, smoked cigars, worked physical jobs, and fought to be called by his chosen name, Harry. As early as 1900, he declared, "I did not like to be a girl. I have never worn women's clothes since I was 11 years old, and I have always been known as a man." This refusal made headlines and enemies. Newspapers hounded him with stories that bordered on obsession. "Girl Man again in trouble," read one headline in the Seattle Times. His relationships with women drew scrutiny, and his every arrest, often for petty crimes or defending himself, was framed as a spectacle. The press dubbed him a man-girl, man-woman, or freak, never once offering dignity. Yet he never backed down. Harry's life was one long act of resistance. While others lived in shadow, Harry lived in defiance. He is the first known transmasculine person in the West whose gender identity is documented in public record, insisted on, not erased. He didn't ask to be accepted. He demanded to be seen. Police records confirm he insisted on being housed with male prisoners. Doctors noted he was unmistakably masculine in appearance. But beyond his body, it was his insistence that mattered. In a time before language like transgender existed, Harry gave it shape through defiance. His relationships, too, were fraught with tragedy. He had several female lovers, some of whom died by one after being forbidden by her family to see him. These events only intensified media persecution. They blamed Harry for corrupting women, never questioning the rigid morality that isolated them. Harry once said, "It is a strange thing to be judged so harshly just for wanting to live in peace." Yet through it all, he lived authentically. He worked as a bartender, laborer, bootblack. He fought, he drank, he danced. When the world called him in between, Harry called himself himself. Boag writes, Harry Allen's story reveals the extraordinary courage it took to insist upon one's gender identity in a world that had no name for it. He wasn't a footnote. He was a forefather. Harry died in 1922, still misgendered in obituaries, but his life remains a testimony, not just to transmasculine history, but to the queer, unyielding spirit of the American West. But Harry wasn't alone. The frontier was full of men who slept side by side, not always brothers, not always blood. Bachelor culture and bunkhouse bonds. The frontier was built by bachelor men, millions of them. Cowboys, miners, loggers, railroad workers. They lived in close quarters, often with no women for miles. In bunkhouses and tents, they shared food, beds, stories, and sometimes more. These spaces were fertile ground for deep emotional and physical bonds between men. Peter Boag writes, the bachelor subculture was intensely homosocial. Emotional intimacy between men was not only common, but necessary. In mining camps, men shared dances, holding each other close to fiddle music. In cattle drives, cowboys often slept two to a blanket, a practical arrangement that sometimes turned into affection. The custom of two men living together and sharing everything was so common, Boag notes, that it was remarked upon only when broken. In letters, we find tenderness that defies the stoic cowboy myth. One miner wrote in 1881, "I miss your company at night. The silence now feels cold." Another confessed, "You are more than a brother to me." To call these men gay in a modern sense risks flattening the nuance of their world. These were relationships without categories. Some may have been romantic, others intensely emotional, still others physical but unspoken. What matters is that they were real. They were chosen families forged in wilderness, long before such words existed. The absence of women did more than shape labor. It reshaped masculinity. With no domestic roles to feminize men, tasks like cooking, sewing, or expressing feelings were normalized. Gender lines blurred not through rebellion, but through necessity. And within that necessity bloomed new forms of care. Not all men welcomed this intimacy. Some feared it, mocked it, or denied it. But it persisted, quietly, powerfully. These relationships didn't seek permission. They simply existed, woven into the daily life of the West. When we remember the frontier, we often remember its violence, but we forget its vulnerability. Bunkhouses were not just shelters from storms, they were shelters from loneliness. And sometimes, in the flickering lantern light, they were shelters for love. While most stories were carved quietly into the edges of the world, others were told in headlines. Crossdressers, drag queens, and queer performers. Not all queerness on the frontier was quiet. Some of it was dazzling. Take Charlie Parkhurst. A famed stagecoach driver in California during the gold rush, Charlie was tough, fast, and fearless. He once killed a bandit with a whip. Only after death in 1879 was it revealed. Charlie had been assigned female at birth. For decades, no one questioned his gender. He voted, smoked cigars, wore boots, and lived as a man. As one paper wrote, among the best drivers in the state was Charlie Parkhurst, who proved that skill knows no sex. Charlie wasn't alone. The frontier loved spectacle, and gender was often part of the show. In mining towns and saloons, men dressed as women in skits and performances. Drag wasn't new, it was expected. Theaters staged all-male casts of Shakespeare, with boys playing the women. In 1869, a Nevada paper described a gay masquerade where men wore corsets, wigs, and rouge, dancing with one another in boisterous merriment. Some of it was camp, some of it survival. For others, it was truth in disguise. Cross-dressing was also a practical tool. Women dressed as men to join military campaigns or find work. Some never went back. Others lived their whole lives in male attire, their secrets uncovered only in death. But not all were hiding. Many, like Parkhurst, simply lived how they wanted and let the world catch up later. In these blurred spaces of performance, labor, and life, gender bent freely. Historian Boag argues that the frontier was more permissive than puritanical. Without rigid institutions or constant surveillance, People had more room to experiment, if only temporarily. It wasn't utopia. Queer performers were often mocked, and cross-dressers risked arrest. But they also found stages, and sometimes applause. They made people laugh. They made them think. And in doing so, they carved out queer joy in a world that demanded conformity. Silence, shame, and memory. Not every story ends with applause. Many ended in whispers, or were never told at all. Some queer pioneers died by... Others were outed only in death. Many more lived full lives whose queerness was known but never spoken. Their histories are buried beneath euphemisms. Lifelong bachelors, inseparable companions, confirmed spinsters. But between the lines, there is longing. In obituaries and oral histories, we find clues. 2 ranchers buried side by side with matching headstones. A pair of women who shared a house for 50 years, known simply as Miss and Miss. Boeg tells of one man who, after his partner died, spoke to no one again for 20 years. That silence holds volumes. The frontier was not a paradise of acceptance. Shame was real. Religion, law, and social scorn pushed many queer people into hiding. But even in hiding, they left marks. Scratched initials, coded poems, saved letters. Their love didn't vanish. It just waited to be recognized. Memory is a fragile inheritance. What we know of queer life on the frontier comes not from archives alone, but from listening differently to what wasn't written or was written obliquely. We must learn to read history's margins. How many more stories, we need to ask, were buried with the men who never spoke and the world that never asked? It's a haunting question, and yet, in asking it, we resist forgetting. The American West is often remembered for its echoes of gunfire, but we must also remember its silences, for in that silence lived countless lives, fierce in their quiet truth. They didn't need labels to be real, they only needed each other. And now, they need us, to remember, to speak, and to listen.